Yesterday, I went to get some dinner for my family. I had one gift card left from all of your generosity at the end of the year. And so whoever gave us Famous Dave's, I do love barbecue, so that was a good gift card. And on my way back, I hit an accident. And you guys know how it is up here. The last 100 yards or so, trying to get across 16 and Gratiot, took me about 25 minutes. And as I got up there, I realized there's one reason. It wasn't the blocked lanes. What does everybody do when they're driving by the accident? It's like 4 cars per light. Well, we like to do it, and it kind of reminded me, though, when I was a firefighter EMT, I had a lot of interesting accidents. Probably the oddest one for extrication, we had a semi who swerved and missed somebody and drove into a house, and the roof of the house entered into his cab and had him pinned against the back of his cab. He lived, he was fine, but it was a combination of the jaws of life and a chainsaw on the roof because we were trying to get this out. I had a few fatalities, and we had some interesting ones. We had one car went through into a house, and the house was a solid 50 yards off the road. Needless to say, they were slightly inebriated. They had some alcohol. But I was thinking about that, and I'm like, well, we like to gawk, right? And so I was like, what are some crazy accidents, that are out there? With the internet, you can see all kinds of stuff. So I found one of a pothole in Detroit. That's not Detroit. It's Fraser. It could be. Yeah, so we have those issues here, right? But that one's a funny one, and I think they didn't know the difference between drive and reverse. What do you think? They didn't know the difference between gas and brake. Or gas and brake. That one was bad. Someone apparently told this guy that he could drive on his pool cover. It's one of those, if you look at that he is on the pool cover in the pool. I don't know. But if you have a wreck with your boat, so all of you that have boats, please don't do that this summer. There's another one better. Please also do not try to park your car on your boat. And lastly, if you're going to launch your boat, this is the wrong way to do it. Now, when things like this happen, what do? We go and we gawk, right? There's a crowd. I imagine that had a crowd. As we start back into the book of John, we're entering into one chapter, basically. John covers a large time frame of Jesus' ministry, and it's kind of the time frame where he was popular. And so Jesus is working all kinds of miracles, and so there's just constantly people there. Why? Well, if people are that were lame and in wheelchairs or whatever started walking, people are going to come and gawk, right? And so this was a time of his ministry where he was very popular. There's lots of people drawing around. And so we're entering into this, the first section here we're going to be into is the feeding of the 5,000. Now this section's recorded in all 4 Gospels. I almost said 5. I don't know. There's a 5th Gospel. No. It's recorded in all 4 Gospels. And in John 6, we have this just little bit of the main part of Jesus' ministry. So John, he doesn't give a lot of emphasis on this, but he records just a few events that he thought were key, and one of them is the feeding of the 5,000. And so as we jump into John 6, we just remember this is the time of Jesus' popularity. It tells us in John 6 that after this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Now, when we read this, we can quickly go, well, after this, okay, move on. Well, after what? So we have to look at the other Gospels. Joe read some from Matthew, and he did mention just previous in Matthew, it gives us some of the events. Now, if we look at the other Gospels, we also know that the 12 have just returned from their first kind of missionary journey. So Jesus gave them a little trial, and said, hey, go out there and preach and heal. And so they just got back, and we have John the Baptist is beheaded. In Matthew 14, right before what Joe read, it says this. At the time Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, this is John the Baptist. he has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are in work in him. Well, why did he say this? For Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. So Herod, he'd done some screwball stuff. He took his brother's wife, and it was just all sorts of not good family relations and not healthy. Because John had been saying to him, it's not lawful for you to have her. And although he wanted to put him to death, he feared the people because they held him to be a prophet. But when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before the company and pleased Herod. Now, I want you to picture this. This is his niece. Get your mind around how twisted this is. So that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. Prompted by her mother, she said, give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter. And the king was sorry, but because of his oaths and his guests, he commanded it to be given. He sent and had John beheaded in the prison, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. And the disciples came and took the body, they buried it, and went and told Jesus. So John the Baptist is killed. Jesus and his disciples are grieving. We have to remember, part of the apostolic band was mentored by John. He had been their pastor. John was Jesus' cousin. And then, as if death isn't hard enough, basically Herod got horny when his niece danced for him and offered in a wedding vow anything she wanted. That's messed up, twisted, and wrong. And then he had to keep that vow. He had his military leaders and peers, so to keep his authority, he had to keep the vow. And so this is what sets the stage for John 6 as we move forward. After this, after all these things, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. I actually like the rendering here in the ESV. This is a large crowd that is constantly, persistently, never letting him be. They don't leave him alone. They follow him. They constantly are surrounding him. And this is ongoing public ministry that's unrelenting. Now, I don't know, some of you may be able to wrap your minds around this. Constant public ministry is a draining thing. Some of you know I love what I do. I love being with you all on Sunday. But after preaching and all of the prep and interacting, my Sunday afternoons, nap time. Because I'm spent. And now imagine this is constant. You can't get away. You can't get any peace. There's just constantly people there wanting more from you. Not that it's bad. He's ministering to them, but they're just wanting more. So at this point, Jesus went up on the mountain. There he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes in and seeing that the large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? And he said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. These 12, they went away. They went up on the mountain to lick their wounds, to grieve. Mark 6:31 in this passage tells us that he said, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while, for many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. This is just constant, unrelenting. You never get a break. I mean, moms, some of you have probably been there, right? Where your kids are like just needing you constantly and you can't seem to get a minute to yourself. That happens to my wife all the time. They can't get away. The other Gospels tell us that they got in a boat to go across, and a crowd of 5,000 men, not including women and children, ran around the lake to get over there and meet them because they're so desperate for something from them, from Jesus. They need something from him. They need something of God and from God. And then before Jesus asked his questions, the other Gospels tell us that Jesus spent the day preaching. Now, I get tired after one sermon. I have mentors that preach multiple times in a weekend, and I'm like, Reverend Chaka, who's been here, I don't know how they do that. I would be wasted. He preaches all day, and then we have this scenario here. So they couldn't process the grief. They couldn't give themselves the time they needed because Jesus has compassion on his crowd, and he said, no, we have to minister to them while they're here. Now, it takes us time to get over a loss, right? When someone dies, now if you mix in the kind of messed up stuff of this, now you're not only grieving, you're angry. And so all of this is going on. So the feeding of the 5,000 is not a miracle where everyone's like pumped and hoorah happy. They're down, they're struggling, they're at the end of the rope. So my question for you is this. What do you do? What is your attitude? Where is your heart when you are backed into a corner? When you're broken, you're overwhelmed, you're at the end of your rope, and God wants more from you. This is where Philip is, right? He's at the end of his rope. He's wasted. He hasn't even had time to grieve. He's tired. And Jesus is saying, hey, where are we going to get food for these people? Where's your heart when God is asking for you to have more compassion on the loss, give more to your family, or God is simply asking the impossible of you and you're already done? Do you get angry? Do you lash out? Do you complain? Or do you buckle down and do what you have to do? Well, it tells us what Philip does. These poor guys, if they had only known that their whole lives would be put out before us for thousands of years, we could study them. Philip gives a logical answer. He says, well, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of us to get a little. So Jesus asked the impossible of him, and he's saying, well, 9.5 months' wages wouldn't even give him a nibble. So there's possibly up to 10,000 people. So in our case, well, okay, picture this. So we have a Deeper Life conference, and way more people come. We've got 10,000 people here. We got the campus filled. Wouldn't that be a cool day? And I look at Cindy Wilson. And Cindy, I need cookies for all of them. And Cindy says, Pastor, if I had 30 ovens in the next 3 days, maybe I could give all of them. But, it's impossible. It's silliness. That's what we have. Jesus' question of Philip, though, sometimes that which God is asking or seeking is not our human knowledge of how impossible it is. He's just saying, do you trust me? Now, we know Andrew has a different response. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many? This is so familiar, we need to not miss what this is. Andrew makes a suggestion in faith, but then almost laughs at his own silliness. So picture, Cindy, I need cookies for 10,000. And Wendy says, well, I've got half a dozen. Do you realize how ludicrous this is? In our leadership structures today, the way we think, we would look at that suggestion and think, how stupid, wouldn't we? What? We want to do this thing, and it's going to cost us $100,000. Hey, I got like 50 cents. We would, okay, yeah, that's nice, but that's not going to do what we need to do. But his answer is one of faith. He said, this is what we got. And he's starting to trust in God. And Jesus, he's like, well, that's kind of nutty. Let's go with it. I like that kind of answer. Those of you that know me well, you give me a really nutty suggestion, I'm like, hey, let's try it out. Yeah, Miriam laughs, she knows. So Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, gather up the leftover fragments that nothing may be lost. So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. As I wrestled with this and what does this look like, I want to ask you this. When God calls you to do the impossible, do you have the faith to dream like that? That, you know what, I've got half a dozen cookies, but with God, it's good enough. Do you have that kind of faith to dream? I often talk about how our denomination started, and it's such an amazing story. This denomination of 6 million believers that has penetrated much of the darkest corners of our world started with a group of men around a stove in a tavern, and they had no resources. Simpson had left his church, and they said, but God. And now look at us. You're one of 2,500 churches in the U.S., 20-some thousand overseas. Do you have that kind of faith? Are you free to bring your little bit, knowing the only way the dream happens is because God showed up? That's the kind of freedom he's called us to. It goes on to tell us that when the people saw the sign they had done, they said, this is indeed the prophet who's come into the world. Now, they have this right. They understand Jesus has got to be the Messiah to pull this off. But the problem is the implications of that. Right? We have the same trouble in churches today, right? Sometimes preachers, they take a passage, right? They pull it out of context, and this is what it means, and it's not even close to the canon of Scripture. That's what they're saying. This is indeed the prophet, because they go on to say they're going to try to make him king by force. Jesus, perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdraws again to the mountain by himself. The crowd tries to make him king by force. As I read this week, there was a comment that I read in one of the commentaries that I think we need to let sink in. Sometimes we make the largest mistakes when we're full and we're satisfied, and we start making decisions based on our continued comfort and not what God would have for us. We do this all the time. We do it in church. We do it in our personal lives. Our largest mistakes are often made when we're full and we're satisfied and everything's like we like it. So it's like, you know what? We're going to make decisions to keep it this way. I like this. And it could be the dead opposite of what God is calling us to. Those of you who know that where Wendy and I come, I'm thankful we didn't make that decision, because coming from a country hick farm boy, suburbs would not be my choice. For one reason, y'all, we got way too much traffic up here. Hall Road, do I need to say any more? Let's not be that way. Goes on to tell us that when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea. They got into the boat and started down across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The other Gospels tell us that Jesus actually sent them out. He went to the mountain, sent them on ahead. And so Jesus sends them out, and the sea becomes rough because of a strong wind that was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea, coming near the boat, and they were frightened. One of the Gospels says that Matthew said that they thought it was a ghost. I don't know what else your conclusion would be. If you're out on Lake St. Clair later and you see somebody walking on the water, what's your first conclusion? Maybe you had too much to drink and you shouldn't be on the lake in the first place. Or a ghost. One of the churches we interviewed at before we came here actually had in the job description, walking on water as a bonus. That's not your first thought, is that Pastor Matt learned to walk on water. No, so they're frightened. And he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." And they were glad to take him into the boat. Immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. Do you see this? The disciples, before we even started this chapter, they're done, they're spent, they're worn out emotionally and physically, they're exhausted. Jesus took 12 grieving, exhausted men and he sends them into a storm, and he wasn't tangibly present with them. When I wrap my mind around that, that challenges my view that I've had of Christ. It is not all cushy. His direction sometimes is straight into a storm that I do not want to go through, or straight into a house fire that I don't want to go through. He'll send you through it. And how often do we find ourselves in the midst of a storm and we can't sense his presence? We're lost in the storm. And if you're there where you're down and out and God has asked too much and now just there's other junk coming around, and then you read promises in Scripture like Matthew 28 where Jesus said, I am with you always, even to the end of the age, that doesn't become comfort. It's like sandpaper on your soul. You're like, I see that. I don't see you. When I worked at the prison, that was my first couple years. God, I read that. I don't see you. Jesus sends them out. It's about 6 p.m. We know that from the time of year this is. And these grief-stricken men, they're done. They've given all they had away to strangers. I think there's another principle here. Sometimes the greatest storms that Christ allows us to go through come right after God does something amazing. Been there? You all been there? Some of like the most amazing church services I've been in were like, man, God was working in my heart, and I was just excited. And then this is every church. It's the person in the foyer that wants to just tear down something from 3 weeks ago, and I lose everything I just experienced. Sometimes the greatest storms come after God has done something amazing. We shouldn't assume that obeying God produces an easy time. Sometimes Christ will stretch you to your very limit, to the limit of your resources, and then he'll ask you for more. Yet God does this not because he wants to crush you, because he wants you to find victory not in your own strength, but in the God who conquers the storm. Jesus sent them into this thing. I said they went out about 6 o'clock. We know from the time frame. Jesus comes at the fourth watch of the night, 3 to 6 a.m., That means the disciples were fighting a storm for a minimum of 9 hours. Now, this is against their logic. Some of these guys are fishermen, and they know at this point, they're like halfway across the lake. They're not making any headway. The logical thing from a fisherman's point of view is you turn around, you let the wind drive you back, and you get back to safe harbor. Now, we tend to dog the disciples, we find every mistake they made. They did something really well here. Jesus said, go there, and despite all reason, they kept rowing, going there. They continued to trust him. What do you do when you have a clear direction from the Lord and you hit the storm? Do you turn around? Do you follow all the well-meaning advice of those people around you telling you that, hey, you know what? This is obviously not working out. Maybe you should think about this. This didn't, right? Because we tend to judge God's direction on circumstances. One of the things it drives Wendy and I nuts sometimes is the pastors that talk about when they moved, because we moved, and like, oh, God was so in this. It was so his plan because our house sold right away. We found another house right away, so God must have been in that. Well, by that logic, God was apparently not in ours because it took us nearly 3 years to sell our home. But the Christ who sent these grieving, exhausted men into a storm sometimes sends us down paths we don't want to go. The trial of the storm comes against them. And when your storm comes against you, do you go with reason of the world, or do you stay obedient to the call of Christ? The other Gospels also tell us that when he got on board that they worshiped him. Now think about it. They were done. Their friend has died. They have just ministered to a bunch of strangers all day long. Now they've rowed all night long. They have nothing left. And Jesus gets there. And when everything's stripped away, they worship. When God takes everything away from you, you have no friends to turn to, your resources are done, you have no emotional energy, you have no mental energy, you have nothing left. Do you break? Do you get angry? Do you complain? Or do you worship? Last week I referred to Ephesians 5:1-2, which tells us to therefore be imitators of God as beloved children. Walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us. We're supposed to imitate God. We're supposed to be following in his footsteps. And we have promises in Scripture like Mark 9:23, which tell us all things are possible for those who believe. So in the storms, when things go wrong, when things are just not the way we would have them, are you obedient to the call of Christ? Do you respond in love? Do you respond in worship? Because sometimes that's a miracle in itself, right? When the storm that's coming against you is your friends or something you care about, you're just like, well, I don't really want to worship right now. Sometimes loving's the difficult miracle. Sometimes following Jesus is lonely, hard, scary, unpleasant. People that preach this prosperity gospel about how everything's going to go right in your life apparently have never actually worked for the real King of Kings, because it's not like that at all. So my questions I want to leave you with today, as we look at this passage and we look at the disciples' response, which some of them was really good. Where is your heart when you are hard pressed on every side? When the world seems like it's against you, when things are going wrong, somebody has done wrong to you, something horrible, and like the disciples had with the killing of John, when just everything is against you, where's your heart? Are you still drawing near to Jesus, trying to get away with him? Are you responding in hatred or anger? Do you keep faithfully rowing ahead against the storm, not turning back when all reason says to? Are you obedient in the storm even when God's presence isn't tangible? And I'm not talking about the basics of like, I'm having a rough time, I'm still going to church. That's good too. That's God's calling. But sometimes he gives us a very specific calling. I want you to minister to that person. And I'll point at Mark because I don't mind half insulting Mark. I want you, Pastor Matt, to minister to Mark despite what he may say or do or anything. Mark's really easy to minister to. He's a good friend. But we have this, right? We sometimes God puts those people in, and when things start going awry and they lash out and it's hard, what do you respond with? Do you keep pressing into God's leading? Or do you turn around and go with the driving winds? Back to your safe harbor. Thirdly, when God leads you to do the impossible, do you offer up your meager 5 loaves and 2 fishes? And say, here you go, Lord, let's go for a ride? Or do you sit there and tell everyone around you why the thing you feel led to do is not actually God's leading, because you know what? This is unreasonable what he's calling me to. We all know people that do this. Lastly, when everything's stripped away and all you have left is God and your ugly circumstances, are you moved to worship? It's hard to talk about ugly circumstances when there's such a cute baby right there. It is. These are like litmus tests of your soul. How you respond in these situations really tells us where you are. if when everything's stripped away, you start lashing out and you're angry and you become mean to the people around you, you're not worshiping God. It's not good.